Abigail Spanberger, she's, running on economic issues and she's trying to tie the lieutenant governor to Donald Trump, who I should note has never won Virginia in his three presidential elections. So obviously, Democrats are probably looking at her race to see whether it's effective or not.
Welcome to Deep Dive. Here at the Washington Examiner, we dig deep into what's happening behind the scenes in the nation's capital. And this week we have someone who's in the trenches to give us clear insight. Mabinty Quarshie is a national political correspondent for the Washington Examiner who's been watching the Virginia governor's race closely. For more, we turn to Mabinty. Well, Mabinty, thank you so much for joining us. And for viewers who haven't been following the race closely, can you give us a quick overview of the key players, Republican Winsome Earle-Sears and Democrat Abigail Spanberger, and what makes this particular gubernatorial race so significant nationally?
Yeah, so Virginia's off-year gubernatorial race is a political bellwether. It's one of two races that are happening this year that the national media is focusing on, Virginia and obviously New Jersey. But basically, Virginia is the warning sign. And usually the party who wins the Virginia governor's mansion, they usually tend to have a good midterm the following year and less so for the presidential election. But basically, whoever wins the Virginia gubernatorial race, it will give us some early signs about how voters are feeling about the Trump administration. It'll give us some early signs about what we can expect from the 2026 midterms. And it's a big signal to both parties about what strategy worked and what strategy didn't work. But Abigail Spanberger, she's focusing a lot on economic issues, while Lieutenant Governor Winsome Earle-Sears is focusing a lot on cultural issues. And so whoever wins the race, that'll give us a clue as to what issues are resonating with American voters across the nation.
Interesting. And Virginia has become known as a bellwether state, as you just mentioned. Can you tell us about the historical trends in Virginia elections, particularly how the results often, you actually just answered all that. I'm going to skip that.
Well, no, I can give a little bit of further explanation.
Okay.
So the thing about Virginia that's so fascinating is usually the party that controls the White House loses the Virginia governor's race the following year. There's only been like one exception in the last like 50 years, and that was under former President Barack Obama when the Democrats managed to like eke out a win in Virginia. But normally what happens is if a Republican is sitting in the White House, then a Democrat wins the Virginia governor's mansion. Vice versa, if a Democrat is sitting in the White House, then a Republican wins the governor's mansion. For example, it was under former President Joe Biden that Republican Governor Glenn Youngkin flipped Virginia's mansion for the first time since 2009. That's why we call Virginia the bellwether race, because it usually tends to show us the backlash of how voters are feeling about the president at the White House.
Interesting. And so Glenn Youngkin's victory in 2021 was seen as a major upset. In your opinion, how are the strategies employed by Earle-Sears this year similar or different from Youngkin's approach?
Well, because she's his lieutenant governor, she's basically running on basically continuing his administration, basically saying that what we did over the last 4 years was good for Virginia and we're going to continue to do that. And she's also, I should know, and I should point this out, but Governor Youngkin, part of his success back in 2021 is he ran on parental rights. A lot of people were upset with former President Joe Biden and how he handled COVID and public schools. And so that sort of backlash boosted Governor Youngkin and Lieutenant Governor Winsome Earle-Sears to the governor's mansion. This time around, the lieutenant governor is again sort of trying to run on those issues. She has knocked Abigail Spanberger over and over for supporting transgender policies in public schools. And that has been a very big issue for a lot of families in Northern Virginia. There are several counties in Northern Virginia, at least five, that are, in an issue or in an entanglement with the Trump administration over their transgender policies. And so that is a big issue that the lieutenant governor is trying to run on this time around, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And Spanberger seems to be consciously avoiding some of the pitfalls that tripped up Terry McAuliffe in the last gubernatorial election. So what specific strategic choices is Spanberger making to position herself as a more moderate candidate for Virginia voters?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I will say that Terry McAuliffe, not to be too presumptuous, but I do feel like he was a weak candidate and he ran on the fact that he was a former governor and that would be enough to boost him to the governor's mansion again. Abigail Spanberger has never been a governor for Virginia, and so she does not have sort of that arrogance that Terry McAuliffe might have had back in 2021. What I will say is that Abigail Spanberger, the district she used to represent Republican district and she flipped it and it was a very tight race. And it even got redistricted after the 2020 census and she again won that race. So I will say that Abigail Spanberger has a history of running in these very tight races and winning. So that is sort of helping her in her race against Lieutenant Governor Winsome Earle-Sears. And I should say that Republicans have tried to link her to the New York City mayoral candidate, Zohran Mamdani. The only thing is that Abigail Spanberger, while she was a congresswoman, she has a very public history of trashing the far left of the Democratic Party. She, very vocally, or I should say, in a leaked call, very vocally trashed the defund the police movement. She wasn't a fan of that and thought it cost the party seats back during the 2022 midterms. And so I will say that Abigail Spanberger, she's, running on economic issues and she's trying to tie the lieutenant governor to Donald Trump, who I should note has never won Virginia in his three presidential elections. So obviously, Democrats are probably looking at her race to see whether it's effective or not moving
See.
forward.
And a few of the articles mention the sign incident that targeted Earl-Sears with racist language. Can you tell us more about how this event played out and how it potentially impacted the dynamics of the race?
Yes. So, as I mentioned, the lieutenant governor has been running on attacking Abigail Spanberger over transgender policies in public schools. A Democratic volunteer showed up to a meeting that the lieutenant governor was having in Arlington County and basically had this racist sign. I'm not going to repeat the language, that's not for me to do, but basically, had a sign alluding that African Americans can't drink public fountains in response to transgender policies, and the lieutenant governor is obviously a black woman. It sparked outrage. That sign goes viral. Republicans, Democrats condemn it, but it does boost the lieutenant governor because she starts to have a lot of fundraising momentum off of that sign. And so basically, we have Robert Johnson, who's the billionaire founder of BET. It's a Black Entertainment Television Network. He donates $500,000 to her campaign in response to the sign saying that, that sort of racism, is not acceptable and should be condemned. It forces Abigail Spanberger and the Democrats to go on the offense because this is a Democratic volunteer. It was a part of a separate group, not Abigail Spanberger's campaign, but it was a Democratic aligned group who did this, or I should say the activist was part of a Democratic aligned group who did this. And it sort of gave, Winsome, the momentum, heading into the final weeks of this campaign to say, this is what the Democrats represent. This is who they are, even though they're supposed to be the party of DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion issues. Here's one of their supporters showing up to attack me in a racist way. And it was very uncalled for.
Wow. Wow, really hard to hear. And Spanberger secured the backing of the Virginia Police Benevolent Association, which backed Youngkin in 2021. What does this endorsement signal about the perceived strengths and weaknesses of each candidate on the issue of law and order?
Yeah. So this sort of ties back to the question you asked me about Abigail Spanberger and Terry McAuliffe and how I said he was particularly weak and that Abigail Spanberger does have a history of running in tight races. And so the awkward thing about this is that the endorsement, so Winsome Earle-Sears did not get their endorsement, but the lieutenant governor nominee and the Attorney General, Jason Miyares, they did get that endorsement. So it was very awkward because the only Republican who didn't get that endorsement was Winsome Earle-Sears, while Abigail Spanberger did get that endorsement. And so the awkwardness of this race is that Winsome Earle-Sears had a very tough summer. That's why that sort of racist sign was a really big boost to her because her campaign was struggling to sort of unite and excite Virginia Republicans in a way that Abigail Spanberger is doing with the Democrats here in Virginia. And so, that endorsement sort of speaks to a sort of unease that the GOP might be feeling about Winsome Earle-Sears' chances to hold on to the governor's mansion. And it might also suggest that we might see a split ticket win in Virginia, where, maybe one party wins the governor's mansion and another party wins the attorney general's race. And maybe, and then another party wins the lieutenant governor's race. It's sort of an awkward situation that doesn't normally happen.
Wow, interesting. And the Trump administration's federal workforce cuts seem to be a significant factor in this election, particularly in Northern Virginia. How are both campaigns addressing the economic anxieties stemming from these cuts? And who do you think is resonating more with voters on this issue?
That's such a great question, Natasha. So again, I mentioned this. I know I keep saying that, but bear with me. But part of the reason why Abigail Spanberger keeps trying to link Winsome Earle-Sears to Donald Trump is because a lot of Virginia's economy, especially in Northern Virginia, which I should say, is a heavily Democratic part of Virginia, but a lot of those jobs are tied to the federal government. And it's not just the federal workers, as a lot of my sources have stressed to me, is that the federal workers, the contractors, the restaurants that sort of serve these federal workers, that all of those industries are being impacted by the cuts at the federal government. And that's a huge part of our economy in Northern Virginia, but also there are parts in Richmond and down in the Virginia Beach area that, rely on contractors and federal government workers. So, it is a hit to Virginia when these federal workers are being cut. When I did interview Winsome Earle-Sears, she did say that, Virginia has a surplus. We have a website trying to help so these impacted workers find new jobs. She basically said that Governor Youngkin and herself are working to make sure that federal workers find different areas of employment, while Abigail Spanberger is attacking Winsome for supporting Trump's cuts to the federal workforce. The second part of your question about who's doing the better job. If we look at the polls, and polls are not perfect, I just want to make that very clear as we saw in 2024. Polls are not perfect. But if we look at the polls, Abigail Spanberger has always led in every single poll. In defense of Winsome Earle-Sears, though, the gap has narrowed. Like back in spring, early summer, Spanberger's lead was in the double digits, like 12, 14 points. But we just had, like, literally this morning, or this week, I should say, we just had a new poll from VCU that showed Abigail Spanberger only leading by 9 points. She's at 49%, while Winsome Earle-Sears is at 40%. So again, she's still leading, but the gap has narrowed, which suggests that the race might be, tightening in the post-Labor Day stretch. And again, I should point out that in 2021, during Governor Glenn Youngkin's race, he didn't really lead the race at all in polling until like October 28th after his debate against Terry McAuliffe, where he really leans into the parental rights movement. So, Winsome and Abigail will be debating on October 9th. Maybe that's a game changer. Maybe Winsome says something that sort of propels her at the very end of the race and boosts her poll numbers. But as of right now, Abigail Spanberger has been leading consistently, but her lead has narrowed, to be fair.
And Spanberger is making a concerted effort to kind of shore up support among African American voters. What specific outreach efforts is she undertaking, and how crucial is this demographic to her chances of winning?
Yeah, that's such a great, great question. So just a little bit of history. So Abigail Spanberger, part of the reason why she has a bit of a fundraising lead when it comes to lieutenant governor is because she has been running for this race for a while now, even if it wasn't officially. She had told Democratic leaders a few years ago that I'm not going to stay in Congress. I'm going to run for governor. And I should point out that both her and Winsome, they didn't really face any real primary challengers. Although in Abigail's case, I should say, there was a moment when we thought that Congressman Bobby Scott, who is black, was gonna run in the Democratic primary because there was some skepticism that Abigail could gin up support among African American voters who make up a very key base of the Democratic Party, especially here in the South. I know Virginia is maybe less Southern than the Deep South, but it is the South, and African Americans still make up a big size of the Democratic base. And I should point out that Abigail Spanberger is obviously a white woman, but there was concern that like she just wasn't enthusiastic to Black voters here in Virginia. And that is why we see her show up at Congressman Bobby Scott's Labor Day cookout because he is a very prominent Black congressman from Virginia and she does need that support. We see her go and visit 7 Black churches down in the 757 area where there is a heavily concentrated Black population there because she knows she needs their support. If she wins, it's gonna be because she got a decent amount of Black voters. And I think that was also the issue with Terry McAuliffe, right? Like he wasn't that exciting among Black voters, and that cost him back in 2021. And obviously Abigail is trying not to repeat those mistakes. And so she's trying to well, she does have the backing of the Speaker of the House of Delegates. She does have the backing of prominent Black leaders in Virginia because, also I should know, right? Like Winsome Earle-Sears is a Black woman, and if she were to win, she would be the first Black female governor in the nation, right? Like she is running against someone who could break history. Although to be fair, whoever wins will also make history because it'll be the first time Virginia has a female governor. But she is running against a Black candidate, and so she does need to gin up support among Black voters who might be looking at Winsome and saying, "I want to vote for a Black woman who makes history nationwide."
Yeah, good point. And what are some of the biggest challenges you faced in covering this race, whether it's gaining access to information, dealing with the partisan spin, or just navigating the complexities of the issues at stake?
Yeah, I might have a boring answer for you, and I and I do apologize. Even though this is a bellwether race, it hasn't been as exciting as Youngkin versus McAuliffe in 2021. That race felt so existential. We had this emerging parental rights movement that was really making its way across Virginia. And one of the sources I was talking to mentioned this as well. It's like there's no one real key issue that we feel like is dominating this race, and whoever can win that issue, we know will win the race in November. It's sort of a weird race this time around. I feel like in the past, the governor's race has been much more interesting. Both of these women are running very, controlled races. And I feel like past races have been in some ways a little bit more interesting.
Well, you make it sound exciting regardless, even if it's not as exciting of a race as past ones. So early voting has already started in Virginia. What are some of the key indicators you'll be watching in the coming weeks to gauge the likely outcome of the election? I know you mentioned that the debate would be a big one.
Well, okay. So the thing about early voting, right? That's to your point about the questions you've already asked me, right? Like who is voting, right? Is it Black voters? Is it women voters? Where are they voting? That's a big key, right? Because if we start to see a lot of early voting in Northern Virginia, that's a good sign for Abigail. If we start to see a lot of early voting in the southwest of Virginia, that's a good sign for Winsome Earle-Sears. And also what topics are, energizing them. If they're talking about the economy, that's probably a good sign for Abigail. But if they're talking about cultural issues, that's probably a good sign for Winsome Earle-Sears. And again, the debate is October 9th. It's after early voting has already started, right? So 40% of the bases of either person's base is already turned out. That makes it even harder to have a breakout moment that like really changes the race at the debate. So we're looking at all of these issues just to see what it tells us, before November.
Yeah, well, very interesting. Mabinty, thank you so much for your insight and fair reporting on the Virginia governor's race. We look forward to more of your coverage on this topic.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for watching Deep Dive. Please visit us on our website for more of these investigations and feel free to send us your questions or story ideas. We hope to see you back here next week.